friends, in the series which we are doing, the history of India from 1700 to 1950, we will today talk about the moderates. In the earlier lecture, we talked about the origins of the Indian National Congress, and we talked about that how that particular period from 1885 to 1905 is the period which is referred to as the moderate phase of the Indian National Congress. And the economic critique of the moderates is one of the important highlights of their achievements, in that sense that the people, those who were associated with the Congress during that time, and how they tried to in a way present the picture where we find that the economic policies which were followed by the colonial rulers at that point of time, they were responsible for the poverty of India, and the kind of famines which were there at that point of time, they were also as a result of the colonial policies which were followed by the British. So when we tend to understand the colonial policies and their impact, we find that how moderates, they wanted to in a way convey these kinds of policies to the Indians by engaging in some kind of petitions, because the politics of the moderates was seen in the framework of the petition, prayer and protest. And for these petition, prayer and protest, they were also being criticized by the extremist group of the Congress, those who called them the mendicants. And when we talk about the contribution of the moderates, we find that they tried to convey the ideas of that particular age to the British through written petitions, and at the same time they were also being criticized that they believed in the British innate sense of justice. So these kinds of arguments which have been put forward by the scholars with regard to the moderate politics which was followed at that point of time. And we also see that the kind of contribution which was made by them at this point of time in the context of, because it was also the initial part where we find that Congress as a political body was entering the phase of the national movement. And we see that during this particular period they were also known as the Indian liberals in that sense. And as I told you, that how their system in which they had this kind of a belief in the justness of the British rule, and they wanted to achieve Swaraj within the framework which was designed by the British. So they in a way believed in the policy of gradualism and constitutionalism, and we find that they felt that British, they were the just rulers, and over a period of time British would provide them the kind of independence or the Swaraj which they wanted from them. So this kind of a thing was in a way criticized by others. They said that this was some sort of a mendicancy, and they were being called as the armchair intellectuals. So they needed to bring some kind of a change in the kind of politics or the policies which they were following. But when we tend to consider the kind of demands which are made by them, because they said that how the simultaneous examination for the Indian civil services in India and abroad should be conducted, and the judiciary should be in a way separated from the executive, the organization of the provincial councils should be done, and the direction of the military expenditure should be met, and the repeal of Arms Act should be done, or the abolition or the reconstitution of the Indian Council should also happen, and the introduction of the permanent settlement to the other parts of India should also be the priority of the British. So in that sense, various kinds of demands which were raised by the moderates, they in a way brought a lot of awareness among the masses as well, because when they were talking about the simultaneous examinations for civil services in India, then they were trying to communicate that how civil services should be more Indianized, and how more and more Indians, they will be able to join the civil services when opportunities will be provided to them. Or for that matter, when they were trying to talk about the military expenditure, that how the higher military expenditure which was there should be reduced, because then only that expenditure would be spent on other welfare and important schemes. So their concerns, their demands, were all legitimate in nature. They were also aware about the Indian situation, and they also wanted, in that sense, that British should bring about these kinds of reforms so that the Indians, they are not at a receiving end of the British. And they also made some kind of concerns where they opposed the repeal of the Ilbert Bill. And Ilbert Bill, when it was repealed, we find that they talked about that the trial by jury which was introduced. So all of this was trying to communicate that Ilbert Bill wanted to bring about some kind of a racial equality in India. So they were supportive of that, and in that sense they were not only talking about what was happening in India, but at the same time we find that they were also talking about the welfare of the indentured labor that went to the foreign countries. And so how these people, they were being treated in those offshore lands, and how they were being, in a way, their condition could be improved, was one of the concerns of the moderates. They were also talking about the liberation of the Indian women and the dilution of the caste divisions which were there in the society, and they very well understood rather, that the emancipation of women and the issue of caste was an important concern in India. And if they will be able to in a way ameliorate the condition of both these sections of the society, then the Indian society will be reformed as well. They were aware about the issue of education, as we have seen that Gokhale moved a private members bill in 1912 for making the primary education compulsory. So they in a way understood the importance of education, and they wanted that the British should provide the Indians compulsory education so that Indians are able to improve their own condition. And they also suggested that the public purse should be given to the Indians, because a lot of money was going out of India through the drain of wealth. And Dadabhai Naoroji and other moderates, they raised such kind of concerns that how the Indian exchequer was becoming poor by paying for the British finances. So such kind of concerns, they were also being raised by them. And then when they talked about no taxation without representation by borrowing from the American War of Independence, where the same kind of demand was raised. They also talked about the idea of Swaraj or self-rule for the Indians within the colonial regime on the model of a self-governing colonies like Canada or Australia, because at that point of time they felt that Indians, they were not ready for Swaraj, or this kind of an idea did not emerge into their minds that they should go for complete independence. So they were in a way trying to become free or get Swaraj on the model of self-governing colonies like Canada or Australia. And we also see that these moderate leaders, whether it was Gopal Krishna Gokhale in 1905 in Banaras session, and later Dadabhai Naoroji in 1906 at Calcutta session of the Congress, they put forward these kinds of demands where they were asking for the self-rule. And when one is talking about the kind of contribution which they made in the context of not only petitioning to the government, not only asking for the various kinds of reforms or changes which were to be brought about, we also see that they in a way highlighted the reality of the Indian poverty and the economic backwardness which was there in India. And they in a way realized that this situation was because of the British exploitation of India's economic resources. So moderates were very well aware in that sense that how Indian poverty was as a result of the British policies, and India would have been a far more developed country if the economic policies of the British would not have been imposed on India. And the reason for economic backwardness of India were the policies which were followed by the British, and how the Indian economic resources, they were being utilized by the colonial rulers, where we find that a lot of money was being sent to Britain through various kinds of methods. And we find that Dadabhai Naoroji, for that matter, talked about the drain of wealth theory, R.C. Dutt, Vacha, all of them. They talked about the kind of money which was being exported from India out to Britain. And this kind of a drain of wealth also exposed the claims of the benevolence of the colonial rule, where the British, they were in a way arguing that they were there in India to civilize the Indians. And so this kind of an idea where British when they were saying that they wanted to civilize Indians was totally in contrast to what they were doing with regard to the drain of wealth, the money which was going out of India. And in 1867, Dadabhai Naoroji talked about that the drain was around 8 million pounds, and R.C. Dutt estimated at 20 million pounds per year during the early 20th century. So the kind of money which was being exported from India was huge, and we find that this kind of a critique which was being given by the moderates of the colonial rule, it also in a way undermined the legitimacy of the British rule in India. And they also talked about the way the Indian traditional handicraft industry declined during the colonial period, and Naoroji also talked about the question of the state patronage for the development of the native industries, that why British government was not providing any kind of a support to the Indian industries though, so that they can thrive. And Gokhale, for that matter, talked about the kind of protection which could be given to the Indian industries so that they could compete with the British industries, because British industries, they were manufacturing in the factories, and those machine-made products, they were far more competitive when they came to India, and we find that there were very less duties which were being imposed on those British products which are coming to India, and on the other hand the Indian products which were going out to Britain, they were taxed very heavily, so they became uncompetitive there. So they in a way talked about regarding the high salaries of the British officials, that how British officials in India, and when they went to Britain, they were drawing high salaries, high pensions, they were being given to them, a lot of money even for the stores which were there in Britain, they were being paid from the Indian exchequer, and all sorts of allowances etc. which were being given to the officials of Britain in India, and also those who in a way pensioned off to Britain, they were being paid from the Indian exchequer. So this created a lot of situation where we find that the money could not be spent in India. And they also talked about decreasing the land revenue to reduce the burden of taxation on the peasants, because the peasantry was suffering because of the high revenue demand by the British, and they wanted that any kind of economic drain from India should be stopped, and the kind of taxes which were being imposed on various commodities, including the salt tax, they should be abolished at once. And they also talked about the high military expenditure which was in a way depleting the kind of resources which Indians had. And this kind of money which was being invested on the defense budget, it was utilized by the British to fight their own wars in different areas of the world. So across the world they were fighting the wars, and these wars they were being funded by the Indian exchequer. So these kinds of expenses, they were being questioned by the moderates, and when they were in a way questioning these kinds of expenses which were there in the context of the army or the civil services, so they were attacking the basis of the colonial rule in India, and by challenging the land revenue and the taxation policies, they wished to weaken the financial foundation of the British administration in India. So they were very well aware what they were doing, and with this kind of an understanding regarding the colonial rule and the colonial policies with regard to the Indian finances, they were trying to communicate or they were trying to weaken the foundation or the financial foundations of the British administration in India. We also see that how when one is talking about Congress, that how a number of scholars, they have tried to understand the way Congress functioned at that point of time, whether Congress could play an important role during that particular period, or whether it was in a way some kind of a tool in the hands of the colonial government at that point of time, because they believed in the colonial government. So scholars like Anil Seal, they have argued that Congress was a ramshackle set of local linkages, and the task was to organize the annual tamasha, being shapeless and flaccid with their loose organizational structure, decentralized leadership and amorphous following. So the Cambridge scholar like Anil Seal, they have in a way criticized Congress in these words, and the kind of organization of the annual meetings which Congress had in December every year for 3 days. So that was also being criticized by Anil Seal that these kinds of sessions of the Congress, they did not have much to offer, and rather they could be seen in the framework of tamashas, and it did not have any kind of a strong organizational structure. It was quite loose, and the leadership was also decentralized in that way. So scholars, they have in a way tried to criticize Congress in that particular framework, and even scholars like Sumit Sarkar, they have argued that the politics remained a part-time affair for the people, those who were in the Congress, and they passed resolutions on some immediate grievance and otherwise enjoyed long spells of complacent liberation. And the people, those who were associated with Congress, they were anglicized people, they were elitist in nature, they were successful men in their career, and they had little time for the political activity. So we find that the people, those who were referred to as moderates, the people, those who became in a way part of the initial part of the Indian National Congress, they were being criticized by the scholars in these terms, that how they were not practicing politics during the entire year. It was just some kind of a part-time affair for them, and when they met, then they were passing certain resolutions on certain grievances, and these resolutions basically were not taken up in the later times. And we find that the people, those who were part of the initial Congress, those who were known as the moderates, they were elitist in nature, they were successful people, and they were anglicized as well. So the politics in which Congress engaged in the initial part was seen to be politics of the negative consciousness, as they derived their outlines from the British traditions and political system. So the inspiration which was coming to the Congress as a political party in that sense, and the way moderates they were operating at that point of time, it has been argued by the scholars that it was on the basis of the negative consciousness which was there. So their politics was not positive as in that sense, and how the British traditions and the political system, they were more important for these people, and the way they were trying to portray these kinds of demands, that has also been criticized. We find that these kinds of demands, they remained prominent only at the level of the argument, and they remained unfulfilled at the level of application. But we also see that one has to see the kind of the time which was there at that point of time, and how the British rulers, they were not ready to give in. And so even to criticize the attitude or the genuineness in that sense of the moderates during that point of time by some of the scholars is to be taken in the stride that it was also a period when the colonial rulers had a total grip over the Indian situation, and the kind of issues which they raised at that point of time, and these kinds of issues, for that matter, they were not sectional in nature. Many a times they were talking about the indentured labor which was going abroad. So they were not only thinking in terms of the national issues, rather many of the things which were international in nature, they were also being talked about by the moderates. And J.R. Maclean has said that the method of the constitutional agitation is hardly an indicator of their timidness, and having watched the failure of the revolt of 1857, they discarded the traditional method of change, and they talked about the successful assimilation of British parliamentary tradition in that sense as an indispensable condition for India's gradual development towards self-government. So scholars like Maclean, they have tried to defend the moderate politics, that when one is talking about their constitutional agitation in the framework of petition, prayer and protest, then it does not mean that they were timid in nature, because they had in a way seen the revolt of 1857 and they realized that revolt was not successful. So in that sense they had to devise new kinds of ways, and they must have genuinely felt that the British parliamentary tradition was definitely an indispensable condition for the gradual development of the Indians, and that is why they in a way talked about these kinds of aspects. But the critics, they have in a way rejected these kinds of ideas. They have conveyed that the moderate politics was armchair intellectual politics. It was a politics of the mendicants in that sense. And when one is talking about the kind of positive contribution which they were able to make, then we find that they did not play or did not lay a lot of importance on the excessive emotionalism and impulsiveness in their thought pattern. And they also in a way realized the problem of the Hindu-Muslim rift, and they wanted to amicably resolve through the practical solutions at that point of time. And that is how we find that the relations between Gokhale and Aga Khan, they were quite cordial at that point of time. And when one is talking about their program, we find that it was very comprehensive to accommodate the various kinds of interests which were there of the different sections of the society. And their demands which they raised, they reflected the concern that they showed for all sections of the society. And we see that through their politics they were able to lay the foundation of the organized protest against the generations, against the exploitative and the degenerate rule of the colonial rulers. And the kind of critique which they provided with regard to economics, their economic critique for that matter, was a scientific analysis of the poverty of India. So in that sense we find that moderates definitely played an important role from the various or the diverse point of views, and the way they, because Indian politics at that point of time in the framework of the origination of the various parties was at a very incipient stage. So in that sense we find that in the later part they became some sort of an inspiration for the future generation of freedom fighters as well, though they were criticized by the extremist group of the Congress leaders like Lal, Bal and Pal, where we find that Bipin Chandra Pal and Lala Lajpat Rai and Bal Gangadhar Tilak, the famous trio which formed the famous trio of the extremist section of the Congress, they were very critical of the moderate politics, and they called them that the way they were functioning was very timid in nature. So we find that how over a period of time moderates, for example, they were able to create some kind of a situation or niche for themselves, where we see that their achievements have to be in a way examined in the context of the colonial rule. And despite having a number of limitations, we also have to see that the colonial period was a period where Indians, they had to fight with the colonial rulers to achieve any kind of a benefit for them. And if we would keep too much expectations from the moderates, then it would lead to some kind of a criticism. So they have to be in a way evaluated in the context of the oppressive rule which was there at that point of time, and their economic critique of the colonial rule is one of the most potent contributions which moderate politics has made to the Indian history. Thank you very much.